Brene Brown has been my celebrity mentor for many years. I actually struggled with depression before I had a reason to be depressed. Now, the last 20 years has been just imaginable pain. I lost a son in a drowning accident in 2005. I've also lost two other children. Pretty intense story of pain. And I am here turning my pain into purpose. And I love to really look at Brene Brown's words and the way that she has been able to research emotions so that we have a vocabulary to speak about how we feel on the inside. I always talk about we must feel in order to heal. And we live in a culture that we do not want to feel pain. And so whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, we try to fix it. We try to make it go away. And honestly, we would be healthier if we learn to feel that pain. And so I'm going to break down Brene Brown's famous speech and just make it applicable to all of us. We are all on a mental health journey. That doesn't mean a mental illness journey, although some people do have a diagnosis. It means we are living in this world for maybe a purpose, for quality, and, are we really living in the peace and contentment that we are designed to be living in? My name's Christy Bundekumar. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner by trade, so I'm a mental health professional, but my real experience comes from embracing my own journey. I told you about, unimaginable pain of grief and loss, and I'm a grief expert because I have experienced all types of grief, from the sudden loss of a child, to the loss of my husband after hospice, to the loss of myself and my identity, to loss of relationships. I have experienced that loss, and I have learned to communicate that. And that's what I love about Brene Brown, is her dedication to learning how to communicate these emotions. And I can tell you, I'm often my worst critic. So as we go through this speech, in the beginning, she introduced herself that she didn't want to be this famous person. And if you don't know who Brene Brown is, read a couple of her books. She is a PsyD's PhD researcher on emotions. And when she did a TED Talk, her intent was not to become famous, but she did. And, she introduces that a little bit in the first part of her speech. And then she says her therapist and her husband told her not to look at the critics and the comments that people were making about her. And I want to make two notes here. One, that one of the most famous therapists, PsyDs, in this country has a counselor. So there is nothing wrong with seeking professional counseling. I want you to get that from this speech. But also in protecting her, they told her not to look at the negative comments. What do you think she did? She looked at the negative comments and began to kind of take those on. And she talks a lot about, not in this speech, but in all of her work, shame. And shame is different than guilt. Guilt is where you maybe do something wrong and you do need to apologize. You do need to adjust. Shame is when you just really don't think you're enough and you're your worst critic. This is me, unfortunately, way too much. I am working on it, but I am my worst critic. And she too was her worst critic. And this speech really gets down to that transformation that happened with her as she was reading these negative comments and realizing that it was bringing up shame and doubt in herself, the things that she learned by going through that process. And she starts with a quote by Theodore Roosevelt, and it says, "It's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done it better. The credit belongs to the person who's actually in the arena." So she's showing up. She's showing up and sharing, vulnerably sharing. And this is one of the things that I talk about a lot. For me, this is my purpose, to vulnerably share that yes, I struggle with shame and doubt. Yes, I struggle with depression. But how do I get stronger in that? Because when we keep it a secret, we just are internally feeding it all of the time, and we're not actually growing in that strength. Those whose face is marred with blood and sweat and dust, who at the best in the end knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst is if he fails daring greatly. And Daring Greatly is one of the titles of Brene Brown's book. And this is about that vulnerability, like you're daring to do it. It does not mean that it will be easy. And this was her journey. And that quote was the start to her journey. And she talks about 3 things in 2 different ways. The first thing is showing up. And showing up in that vulnerability. It is not about winning. It is not about losing. It is about showing up. So what does it mean to show up in vulnerability? Well, later down in her speech, she actually asked people publicly on a social media platform, and she had over 150 responses within the first 24 hours. And these are the things that people said. We're newly married and I'm having trouble initiating sex. Another couple other people also said they had shame or hesitation in initiating sex with their partner, being turned down, asking someone out, waiting for a doctor to call me back, getting laid off, having to lay off people, right? The feelings behind those things, as I said those words, some of you resonated with 1 or 2 of those. And what is the feeling underneath that? Because that's what we don't talk about. We do a lot of it internally, and if we're keeping it a secret and we're not actually working through that, this is where we are getting stuck. And so vulnerability doesn't have to be, a big name on a stage, sharing your story in front of hundreds of people. That doesn't have to be vulnerability. It could be being honest with your partner, being honest with your friend, being honest with yourself. That's vulnerability. That's showing up. The second thing is be prepared for it to be hard. And she talks about like her going through this process, and her first thing is, I'm never getting on stage again, right? But then she realized, this is what I want. I want to create, I want to make things that didn't exist before. I want to show up, and I want to be seen for my work and in my life. So what do you want? When she realized that is what she wanted, she knew she had to be okay or be able to face those criticisms, right? And her third thing, she talks about courage is a value that we hold, but often has a consequence we want to avoid, right? So for her, it's the big stage. For me, also, I want to very publicly share my vulnerability, but I have to realize that there may be consequences and there may be judgment. And her third thing is a little harsh, and she knows that, and she kind of explains that. If you're not in the arena getting your ass kicked, I'm not interested in your feedback. Not just, not standing up and being vulnerable, but if you're not being vulnerable in your life, how can you criticize me? And, recently I have been working through some of the shame. I was doing lots of medical tests, and we're finding out that I'm holding on to things, physically holding on to things, holding on to toxins, holding on to fat. And oftentimes physical symptoms are a manifestation of something emotionally or spiritually underneath it. And for me, this specific thing was about letting go. And letting go for me was shame, and the way Brene Brown defines shame. It's like letting go of that being sensitive and defensive. I've always been called sensitive, and I fight it. I'm like, this is who I am. I'm not sensitive. I'm passionate. And all those things are true. And I am real and vulnerable with the fact that I am a sensitive person. But in this scenario, as I'm going through her speech and she's talking about like, you have to show up, you have to know that it's hard, and then you have to be able to let go of some of the hard. And that's where I am in my life right now, of like letting go of some of that hard, letting go of that criticism. I recently had a friend, we were discussing this, and she said, well, but what if those negative things that we say or the criticism that's coming from other people is actually true, right? Like, to be authentic, we also have to be vulnerable in our mistakes, vulnerable in, so let's take, Christy, you're too sensitive, right? And so then I kind of get defensive and fight that. But there's part of that that's true. And so as I'm having this conversation with the person who was really trying to challenge me, that said, yeah, but you're too sensitive. You are taking on everything and feeling like you have to process everything in this pursuit of being authentic and vulnerable. And I had to sit with that for a minute, right? So the things that people say could be true. Are they important for you? Brene Brown talks about this. This has happened to me, where someone will make a comment about me physically, like, you're not pretty, or boy, I could really see the wrinkles in your neck in that video, right? Those could be true statements. They're hurtful, but they're not something I necessarily need or want to change, right? Like, so when you're thinking about criticism, we're also prioritizing criticism. For me, I want to be authentic. I don't want to snub my sensitivity, but I also don't want to be too sensitive and stressed out because everything is impacting me, right? So yes, when you take, there are times when you take criticism and you need to make adjustments. I talk about this in the Mentally Strong method of being like different categories, right? So going back to my sensitivity, right? That is, my sensitivity is part of my story. It can be triggered. That triggers is a category by itself. Core connections, oftentimes it goes back to some core connections of not feeling like I'm good enough and that I need to do more. But we also have a category called behaviors and choices. And is there something that I need to change? And what I have realized just recently in the last couple of weeks is that letting go of the shame, letting go of perfection, letting go of disappointment, and bracing constructive criticism, bracing the truth, and trying to be as authentic as I can in a non-stressful way. Because sometimes you can be so empathetic, so sensitive, that you're literally on cortisol alert all day long. And I've been there. So again, it's a continuum, and there are things that we need to let go. So what are we doing with our vulnerability if we're not expressing it? In one of Brene Brown's other books, she did a study and she asked people what feeling words, do they, use or feel most often. She got happy, sad, and angry. Most people are only communicating with those 3 words, and there's so many more words to be used. And oftentimes we're not even feeling, right? Remember what I said about we live in a culture where we're trying to fix pain, and we fix pain with numbing it. We talk a lot about numbing with addiction, and there's addiction that needs, specific addiction treatment, right? Addicted to drugs, addicted to alcohol. But I even have addictions. I can get addicted to, the quick feeds of social media. I could get addicted to the negative thoughts going around in my head. We can get addicted to exciting things. We could get addicted to, lazy things like detaching. We could get addicted to so many things. And I just want you to change that word addiction to numb. What are you using to numb the pain instead of feeling the pain? And she said something profound here, which I've known it, but it really resonated in this speech. She said, you cannot selectively numb feelings. So if you are trying to numb pain, you're also going to numb love, gratitude, happiness. So just be aware, just take a moment right now. What are you using to numb? And be aware that you're also numbing positive. Now, are there positive things to do? If movement definitely can do both. It can numb or process or move pain. I have so many people that are like, they tell me running is their therapy, which I think is great. If you need a plan B in case you ever have an injury where you can't run, but also making that conscious, right? If it's just a numbing, then you might be numbing everything. But if you get ready for that run or that hike or that some exertion and you say, I'm going to work on processing grief in this run, or I'm going to work on releasing that negative thought that I'm not worthy that started in my trauma, right? Like bringing a consciousness and awareness to it can make something that is numbing actually healthy. So moving things out of the body, going to counseling and talking about it can both be good and bad, right? If all you're doing is ruminating and the counselor is not getting you to those next steps of release, then you could just be ruminating, right? And so making sure that we are taking these feelings and feeling them in order to heal, not numbing. I love the way, I don't know, I haven't seen in writing Brene Brown's mission, but what it appears to be is that if she could just teach individuals to be aware and conscious of their emotions and know how to process them, she can make the world a better place. She talks a little bit in this speech about it doesn't have to be an addiction. Religion has changed from being like a belief in faith and mystery to a certainty of right and wrong. And I have been in this culture, and if you've seen my documentary, you have seen that after losing my third child, I had to go on my own spiritual journey because I came from a Christian faith that told me exactly how to have a relationship with God. And in the end, I was able to have a genuine, authentic relationship with what I call God. But we see this in religion, we see this in politics, where it's right or wrong, and there's so much emotion behind it, but it's demonstrated as blame rather than like, how does that actually make me feel? So instead, it's like pointing to the other side of blame. That religion is wrong. That side of politics is wrong, and I'm right. And it's kind of that fight and defensive-ness. And I love what she said here when she's talking about politics. She said, "There's no conversation that there's just blame. You know how blame is described in research." It is a way to discharge pain and discomfort. Think about that for a moment as we point at the people we believe are wrong because they don't believe the same as us. We're really likely discharging some pain. And so if we could take the time to self-evaluate, we could be better humans for ourselves and for others. She goes on in her speech to talk about a lot of other lost priorities in our culture because we are either blaming or numbing our feelings or trying to just have this external view of perfection. And then she goes into raising kids. Wanting to be the perfect parent, raise the perfect kid, making sure that they are in sports and music and that they're the best at all of these things, and getting our worth from where our children are in this hierarchy. And I can tell you, I'm guilty because I didn't feel my children ever measured up. I had 5 adopted children that were dealing with their own grief and trauma as they integrated into my family. And then I had 2 special needs children with a rare neurodegenerative condition. They were born normal and then just kept getting worse. And so I remember going to IEP meetings, which were the thing you went to at school. And every year the teachers would be like, well, we got to decrease the goals. And I'm like fighting for someone to believe in me and my ability to raise these kids and in my kids. And I was trying to get my worth from those external validators, per se, right? And here's her statement. Here's Brene Brown's statement on raising kids. If we could raise kids that knew they were imperfect and that they were wired for struggle, but they were worthy of love and belonging, how much better would this world be? And I get choked up with that because I'm done raising my kids. I've lost 3 of my 7 children, and I'm 52 years old, and I'm still trying to figure out how to feel worthy of love and belonging. And then we do it to ourselves, and then we do it to our kids, and then it just keeps going. On a bigger scale, so she talks about individually working on ourselves, how we're raising our children, but then how we're showing up in the community. We often pretend that what we do doesn't have an effect on other people, and it does. And she goes on to give both individual and corporate examples of how our decisions impact other people. So what can we do? In the beginning, she talked about the 3 things being showing up, understanding it's going to be hard, and not being too sensitive or too numb in that vulnerability. And she says almost the same thing, but a little differently. And this hits home very personal, and you can, put it into 3 words, right? First, be authentic. What does that mean? Being real with people, with yourself. 2 is to practice gratitude. It is so easy to focus on the negative, or it's easy for me. It's harder for me to find the positive. I could get 20 comments, one of them be negative, and I'm giving more energy to that negative comment. Don't do that. Find the positive in your life and be grateful for those. And I'll tell you this, 60-40 rule, because oftentimes, especially with the hardship that I have been through, like I am kind of tragically optimistic. I truly believed that I was going to save my son, that my son was not going to die, even though he had 10 years of medical trauma. And then when he died, it was just like, it doesn't matter how positive I think, bad things still happen to me. But here's the 60-40 rule. If you focus on the positive will come to you, right? You talk about that in manifestation, but it's not at 100%. We will struggle. Everyone will struggle. But if you focus on the positive, you can get those positive things to be about 60%, and you're happier because you're focusing on that 60%. If you are negative all the time, it's not that there's no positive in your life. It's just probably flipped, and the positive is 40%, and you're not focusing on it. So yes, manifestation is real, but it doesn't give 100% easy, right? But that gratitude and finding the positive, you will have more of that in your life. And most importantly, and I am still working on this, I am enough. You are enough. Truly believing that we are enough. That if we believe that, we become that. And then we are more content. We are more productive and purposeful. But when we don't believe it, it's very hard for it to actually be evident. Be authentic, practice gratitude, and know that you are enough. Continue following me. I do a lot of work on grief and topics on grief. And everyone knows someone who has gone through grief. you've probably gone through grief. But start with my video, Helping Your Friend Go Through Grief. Thank you.